All right. We are in Philippians chapter 3, the very end of Philippians chapter 3, and we'll show where we've been going. We're in Philippians chapter 3, which is spending time in the concept or the idea that Christ is our hope. Remember, Philippians chapter 3, verse 7 is our key verse, and we'll read that again as we enter into this chapter for the conclusion. It reads this way, "But what things were gained to me, those I counted for loss for Christ." Paul counted a lot of things in this life as if they were nothing, even though to this world's standards they were great things. But he saw the ability for him to be as Christ would have him to be, to live as he was supposed to live, and to influence his world as much greater. Chapter 4, in which we're going to go into in just a minute, is Christ is our strength, and we'll introduce that here in just a second. We're talking about the sections that starts in verse 17, so keep that in your mind as we pick up in verse 20, talking about the false teachers, the false ones who were coming in, and we're picking up in verse 20 tonight. And I want you to look at verse 20. This is where we need to see, and this is probably, if it wasn't for verse 7, if it was not for verse 7, we would pick verse 20 as the key verse. Every now and then you'll have a chapter that has two great passages in it, and here's one of them. Here's verse 20. "For our conversation is in heaven, from whence also we look for the Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ." Go ahead and add verse 21 to this. "Who shall change our vile body, that it may be fashioned like unto his glorious body, according to the working thereby he is able even to subdue all things unto himself." If you look here at verse 21 in this particular scene, I want you to notice the first phrase, "For our conversation is in heaven." What a wonderful thought it is to know that our lives can be lived as if they are in heaven. That's the idea here for conversation. For our lives are lived with eternity in focus. You know, that may be the key of this book, isn't it? This isn't a reproving book. There's not some great problem in the church at Philippi. Though they had to walk out or look out for everything that we have to look at. Do we have to look out for problems we may encourage or we may encounter on our own doing? Yes. Do we have to look out for those who may bring false things into the body of Christ? Yes. But think about this. Do we also have to make sure that our lives are lived as if they have eternity in focus? I think it may be the key of the entire book. The American Standard Version says this, "For our citizenship is in heaven." It's a great way to look at it. Not as if it's something we're going to obtain, but the child of God has obtained in the idea of that's where we will be if we're faithful, heaven. Can you think of anything better than heaven? Yeah, we miss out, we'll miss it all. See, all we can think of are negative descriptive terms to talk about if we miss it. And you know, sometimes we think about heaven and what we think about most of the time is streets paved with gold or the gates. But it's much greater than the physical plan of heaven, isn't it? What's heaven truly about? Being with God. You see, we're at a disadvantage on this earth, aren't we? Not because God designed us with a disadvantage. Not because He intended us to be in this concept. Remember in the book of Genesis when man was created? God, or man was in the garden, woman was in the garden. Who walked in the midst of them? God did. See, it takes you back to Romans 3:23, and it takes you back to the time in which the serpent said, "Thou shalt not surely die." When sin entered into the world, when death entered into the world, when pain and sorrow and suffering entered into the world. See, we live at a disadvantage. But listen to this, verse 20. "For our citizenship, our conversation is in the earth." Is that what he says? Where's it at? Heaven. Isn't it impressive to see what he's saying here? Now, we have to keep this in its context. We go back to verse 17 and remember what's happening in 17 through 19. There are people who, verse 18, are the enemies of the cross. Some were saying in Philippi and in the surrounding cities that Christ never went to the cross. Some were saying that Christ was not who He said He was. Some were saying He wasn't the Messiah. But what do we know about that? we know that they were the enemies of the cross. And that tells us something very important when we look at verse 20. Who is involved in verse 20? Is the enemy of the cross living a life that's in or within a realm that's focused on heaven? Is it? You remember in the book of Matthew how Jesus was responding about the judgment day, and he said many will come to him and say they've done many wonderful things in his name, but what's their fate? Depart from me. I never knew you. Understand the reality that's happening in verse 20. We must live our lives in focus of eternity based on truth. That's the context of 17 through 21. Live your life in a focus, a context of truth, which moves us into verse 21. Here's the beautiful of this. We look unto the Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. Now notice the authority that's being described. Who shall change? Who is the who in verse 21? You ever had to ask who is the who? Here it is. Who's the who? Christ. What's Christ going to do? Listen how it's worded. Christ shall change our vile bodies, that it may be fashioned like unto his glorious body, according to the working thereby he is able even to subdue all things unto himself. What is he affirming in verse 21? Number one, he's affirming that Christ will do what he promised. Number two, he's affirming that we will, as the faithful, be with him. But number three, he's affirming that Christ will show himself over all things. Not just life, not just temptation, not just death, not just this physical world, not just in the scope of thinking about miracles, but in the scope of thinking about eternity. God will change, and I love that your Christ will change. I love how it's used here, our vile body.
I think he's saying one more thing, that will be changed into a spirit.
Yes, in its form. Especially when you follow it out, that it may be fashioned like unto his. We don't know what that looks like. And in 1 and 2 Corinthians, we learn that it's foolish for us to try to figure that out because that's God's news. It's not ours. But what's the point that's being made here? He'll outshine it all. In other words, this chapter ends more positive than any chapter has ended in this book. And I want you to notice this. I'm going to have to skip a few slides and we'll come back to them. Look at the very first word of chapter 4, verse 1. What's the word? Standing on the promise of, watching out for those who are false, standing on the promise of, focused eternally, and standing on the promise of the fact that Jesus Christ will shine above the rest, he says, therefore. And we'll get to that in just a minute. But let's look at chapter 4 as we overview it. Chapter 4 is about strength. Christ is our strength, and it's very fitting to know that Christ is going to overcome all. It's impressive to think about Christ coming out of the grave himself. It's impressive to think about Christ saying, Lazarus, come forth. But it's even more impressive to think about Christ raising all of the dead and taking the living. Now you think about that. There's no greater thought than that, is there? Our minds really can't comprehend that, can we? What's it going to look like when every soul comes forth from this ground? You say, we don't fathom that. The 7 billion people now, how many have lived since the beginning? To know that all who have died will be called to a judgment. And those who are faithful, all of those who are faithful, will be turned into an image like he is. I think that's a reality. When you look at the rich man and Lazarus, the rich man knew who people were. He knew who, remember, he even called him by name. Send Lazarus that he may dip forth his finger in water. How did he know his name? It's evident they recognize each other. And I think we will too. But imagine this. It's not going to be this anymore. What's the problem with this body? It's temporary. It wears out. And over time, it wears a little harder and harder, doesn't it? What eventually happens to this body? We don't like to think of this. turns to dust. Here's the reality of that. This body dies. What about your soul? Does your soul die? The soul separates from the body. That's death. And the soul lives on for eternity. Now imagine this. Here's the scenes as we're getting ready to go into this. Christ is our strength. Why? Because He's going to take us home. That's chapter 4 as we enter into it. Here's the section that we're going to be in, verses 1 through 3. And He's going to spend time with these people telling them, you've got to stand firm. He's already told them all of these things, and as you go back to the overview we've been looking at, I want you just to listen to the outline, because everything hinges off of this particular section, especially when we make it into verse 1 with therefore. Remember chapter 1, verses 1 through 2, the introduction, but verse 3 through 11, Paul's gratitude for the brethren. Think about that. Listen how positive this is, and imagine how it picks up in chapter 4. Paul's gratitude for the brethren, Paul's satisfaction in preaching the gospel. Remember what that section was about, verses 12 through 18? His trials, his problems in presenting the gospel. Verses 19 through 26 of chapter 1, his desire to die, but his willingness to live. That's the Christian attitude, isn't it? Be faithful even though persecution results, 17 through 30 of chapter 1. Here's chapter 2, put the other person first. Chapter 2, verses 4 through 11, Christ is our example in service. Chapter 2, work out your own salvation, verses 12 through 18. Chapter 2, 19 through 24, Timothy, no man like him. Verses 25 through 30, Epaphroditus, Paul's brother and fellow companion. Now listen to chapter 3, because this is where it starts to pick up for us. Beware of the Judaizers or the false teachers, verses 1 through 11. 14 through 16, press onward. 17 through 21, beware of false teachers. Now listen to chapter 4. Stand fast. You see the repetition of positive note? And this particular section is going to keep on becoming positive for us, because he's going to spend time talking about how they need to live as he has lived, acknowledge the gift that they sent him, and then in the final place, he's going to give them some final words that they need to know. But listen to verse 1. Here it is. Therefore, my brethren, dearly beloved and longed for, my joy and crown, so stand fast in the Lord, my dearly beloved. I dare you to find a more positive verse. It's going to be hard to find that, isn't it? You're going to have to find a verse that talks about heaven, aren't you? You're going to have to find a verse like verse 20 that talks about the fact that we won't be in this body for eternity, that the faithful will be with God. So he opens up this particular section as he gets into this, and he says a lot of statements. We've already talked about therefore. We'll come back to it in a minute, though. He starts off with this, my brethren. I don't know how many times this phrase has been used in this book. 4 chapters. Quite a bit, it's on our minds. But listen to how he describes, now I'm going to say it this way, you and me. Listen to how he describes you and me. He starts with an outlook of faithfulness. Dearly beloved. What's that mean? Beloved, those that I love. He adds dearly to it to make it sweet and tender. Now listen to this. Dearly beloved and longed for. You ever longed for something? What does that mean? I mean you couldn't wait till they left after they were visiting? Does it mean you can't wait till they get there? Can't wait to be there again? Chapter 4 is probably, in my opinion, now this is my opinion, the most impressive verse that talks about the brethren. Because here is Paul's open heart to his family. That's why I said it's about you and me. My dearly beloved and longed for. Where did he want to be? With the people he was going to spend eternity with. Remember the therefore just a minute ago? What was it there for? Well, it brings us back to the previous chapter and everything we've already surmised. Remember, it's there because of 20 and 21. Because of the fact that our conversation, our focus has to be somewhere else. It's easy to focus on this life, isn't it? Boy, it's really easy. It's really easy to turn on the news, isn't it? Or maybe you get wrapped up in all the political things that are happening in our world. We could spend the rest of the night talking about how weird this country has gotten. But you know what the reality is? Whether she stands and heaven forbid, lest she falls, our focus is still heaven. Now remind yourself of this. Therefore, my dearly beloved and longed for, where is Paul? Where's he at? He's in prison, longing to be with them, ready to die, but not willing to for them. That is the Christian outlook one to another. And let me ask you a question, and this is pointed at me first. What would it look like if we all lived out Philippians 4:1 to heart? What would it look like? It's hard to describe, isn't it? But I think it gives us something to ponder on without even saying words, and gives us something to think of, and gives us something to look forward to. He longs for their company. He desired to be with them, and I love these words. I don't know if they're ever used by Paul anywhere else describing the brethren. My joy and crown. Anything ever made you happy? You'll probably understand this as I said it. I never imagined it could be so, and you'll get this. But when Charlie came around, I didn't understand joy. Now I do. You get it, don't you? These were Paul's children in the faith, and they made him happy. Why? Where did he expect to be with them? Just on this earth? Is that what Paul was wanting? He just wanted to be with them because he was in prison? No. Remember chapter 3, verse 20? You keep your focus on heaven. There's Paul's focus. You're my joy. But I love this. You're my crown. What should we want to wear as a crown? We could wear several things as a crown, couldn't we? We could wear our enjoyments of this life as a crown. We could wear our accolades in work or maybe business or education as a crown. We could wear on our crown the things that we do to help our community. But who does Paul wear? What does Paul wear on his crown? The brethren. Why? Why are they his joy and crown? Is it because he has done something so good that they deserve or he deserves them? Or is it because that they were lost and now they're found? I think we understand why they were his joy and crown. Now, here's the phrase we're trying to get to. So stand fast in the Lord. Now listen to this, my dearly beloved. What do we need to do? I think we could just end the class on this verse. What do we need to do? How do we future-proof ourselves to eternity? You know what keep on keeping on means? What does that mean? When false doctrine comes, what do? I'm going to say this, and I'm going to illustrate it this way. What is it really easy to do? And here's your illustration. It's really easy when life gets hard to sit down. Because if we're sitting down, this is it. There's nothing for me to do. But if I stand up, what have I got before me? Everything. I want to suggest to you that sitting down or being seated in your faith means you cannot be eternity focused. It's impossible. It's impossible for us to stand up when spiritually we've given up. There are many factors that lead to us sitting down. Sometimes, you think of this, and this was mentioned at Ivy Crest privately to me, but someone had passed away there this week, and two of the residents were having a really hard time because they missed him. They took care of him. That's what they did. And it would be really easy for them to just give up, wouldn't it? Because their friend, the one they've been taking care of and cared for, is gone. And every day they come into that meal where he was supposed to sit, he's not. Same thing's true for you and me. When we lose our loved ones, isn't it easy to give up? Isn't it easy to blame God? Why do we die? You ever ask yourself that question? Why do we die? It's appointed unto man once to die, but what brought death into this world? Sin. Let's quit saying God needed another angel. Because if he needed another angel, he'd create one. Death was brought in by sin. The pains of this life, what was it brought in by? Sin. You go all the way down life and you can almost say it was brought in by sin. Now, what is he telling us to do? The hardest thing we'll ever do. Here's the reality of what he's saying. He's saying becoming a Christian was the easy part. Keeping your eye focused on heaven's the hard part. Because this world wants to get you down, doesn't it? Is our world on our side? No, it's not. That's the hard part for most people, for most of us. But he says, my dearly beloved, so stand in who? In who? This helps us answer this. In the Lord. That brings us back to 20 and 21, and it shows us what he's trying to say. It tells us what he's trying to be, and he says we have to stand. And he goes in verse 2, he says, I beseech Euodias and beseech Synecdoche that they be of the same mind in the Lord. Having stated his genuine feelings for them in verse 1, Paul exhorted these two to be of the same mind. But I think he's not only in verse 1 talking about these two, but all the brethren. There must have been, verse 2, some difficulty between these two. You ever seen Christians have a difficulty? Verse 2 is point proven to help us understand that sometimes we don't get along. But you know what we got to do? We got to get over it. Because when we can't get along, we cannot be eternity focused. When we can't get along, we can't stand. When the physical body is well and in good health, there's harmony between its components, isn't it? What happens when maybe your heart starts giving you problems? Can you run your marathon? No. Same thing is true with the Lord's body. What happens when two can't get along? Can it function properly? No. You see, when we boil it down to the terms, the Apostle Paul is talking in this chapter and in the preceding chapter because of the therefore. And when we understand that the little things we bicker about are not worth losing heaven over, we start to see the point. What should we be focused on? What's the one thing we should focus on? Obviously heaven. That's the focus of this book. But what's the one thing we should focus on out in that realm? I think Christ is there, but I think also taking others with us. Verse 2. When we bicker, are we eternity focused? Let's take these two. We don't know what was going on. We have an idea because of what he's saying at the end of the verse, that they be of the same mind in the Lord. He's encouraged them to do it. What do they need to do? They need to put their differences beside them and help the church continue on and obtain as they go. And we look at verse 3 as we look at this particular section, and it reads this way. Philippians 4, verse 3, and I entreat thee also, true yokefellow, help those women which labor with me in the gospel, with Clement also and other of my fellow laborers whose names are in the book of life. Listen to how Paul's talking. In the book of what? Death? Life. What's the book of life? God's roll book. And here's the question of this, and we're going to get to the point of the verse. Would we say, Can we prove by our lives that our names are in the book of life? Here's what's happening in verse 3. There are others who need help. Listen, the Lord's workers need the Lord's people. You know what it could say about this particular section? If Paul were writing to us, he might say, pray for Billy Bland as he's my fellow laborer. Pray for James Jones. Help James Jones and his wife as they're my fellow laborers. Do you see what he's saying? Look at the kingdom. To be eternity focused is to be kingdom focused. Now here's why we say that. Who are the people that are going to be in heaven? The people that are in the church. Why do we ignore the people in the church? I think that's the admonition he's giving. I don't think he's saying that they're doing that, but I think he's telling them, don't forget about yourselves. Don't forget about each other. Don't forget about my fellow laborers. They need your help. The person of verse 3 has always intrigued me. This person is unknown. But the yoke fellow is being entreated. The laborer, the one of which has the weight of the work around his neck, is being entreated to help some people. Specifically, help those women which labor with me in the gospel. Ladies, don't think that you don't have a work in the gospel. I think sometimes that's portrayed. I think in the past maybe that's been portrayed. But there's so much to be done, isn't there? And there's so much that you can do. And this proves it to us. With Clement also, with other fellow laborers whose names are in the book of life, this yoke fellow was supposed to help those. Even the identity of these women, only Clement here is being mentioned, and we have no further knowledge of him. But I ask us this question. Would it be said of us if Paul was writing a letter to East Hill, would it be said of us that we are of these people's caliber? True laborers? Would it be said of us that we're a true yoke fellow, a true worker inside of Christ? It's a spiritual depiction about continuing on and standing fast in the Lord. And I want us to see this in verse 3, especially adding it back to verse 1 and verse 2, really. The Lord's people, the Lord's body cannot do without you. The church cannot stand without you. It cannot continue without you. It cannot be without you. Do you see the implication he's making? Now add this to the stand fast. Is he talking about exclusively, individually standing fast, or is he globally talking about the Lord's people standing fast? Which one is it? Because I think when we look at it distinctively different, it gives us the impact that I believe he's trying to make. I think he's talking about the Lord's people standing fast, not just individuals. Though it takes individuals to do that, doesn't it? But if only half of us stand up for what's right, what's the other half doing? Dragging the other half down. Remember? They're sitting down. What happens when everybody stands up? Nobody has to sit down. Nobody has to be alone. Nobody has to go at it their own. I do want to mention again, as we move from verse 3, I want to mention this book of life. It's absolutely impressive to see the implications of this, even in the book of Exodus chapter 3, or 32 through 33. It reads this way, "Yet now if thou wilt forgive their sin, if not, blot me, I pray, out of thy book which thou hast written." Moses said that. Forgive the people and let me take their blame, Moses says, out of your book, Father. Out of your book, God. The psalmist says, let them be blotted out of the book of the living and not written with the righteous. In other words, the wicked should not be with the righteous. Revelation 3:5, he that overcometh, the same shall be clothed in white raiment, and I will not blot out his name out of the book of life, but I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. Think of the implications of that, the book of life. Revelation 13:18, I know there's a lot of imagery in the book of Revelation. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him whose names are not written in the book of the Lamb, or the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. What's the idea? It's the book of Christ. Do you see the implications being made? Revelation 20, verse 12. And I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God, and the books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books according to their works. This book's going to judge us. And it's going to judge whether we're in the book of life. There's a standard God has set. In reality, it's not complicated. In action, it's extremely complicated. Here's the reality of it. Obey this book. Be in the book that belongs to Christ. The application of that is obey this book. Isn't that complicated? Did anyone say that living as a Christian was going to be easy? What about Paul in prison? You think he ever thought he was going to be in prison? Probably not. Just as much as you and I have been blessed to live in prosperity, what happens when this country doesn't stand for God anymore? What are we going to do? Are we going to ensure that our names are written in the Lamb's book of life? Or are we going to, as we've already stated, just sit down? That's what he's talking about here. If you don't stand, you won't be in the book of life. Now, there is one reality we need to face before we move into the next particular section of Follow Paul's Example. If you don't stand for something, what are you standing for? In the reality of the discussion we're talking about tonight, if you don't stand for Christ, you're standing for the world. Now, that's a reality we don't want to face. Because we want to stand for Christ. We want to do what's right. But sometimes that alienates us from our friends, doesn't it? When you go out to dinner with the friends at work or to lunch, and they all want to drink, and they say it's just one, it won't hurt you. If our young people were in here, I would say it this way to them. When you go to that party and your boyfriend or girlfriend wants to do something that you shouldn't, what do? That's the reality of standing. It's either give in to the world and stand for nothing, or stand up for Christ and focus on eternity. That's the reality. The Lamb's Book of Life. Here's the next particular section, and also verse 4 is a fantastic verse of which could have been the key of this chapter in this particular section. Rejoice in the Lord always. And again I say rejoice. What do they have to rejoice for? Where are their names? Where are their names? Where's your name? That's the way we should ask it. Where's your name? And thus you understand you have something to rejoice. And it brings us back. This is still all connected to chapter 3, 20 and 21. Remember? For our conversation, our focus is in eternity, and Jesus Christ will turn our vile bodies into that which image is His. Therefore, we have something to rejoice. Paul was imprisoned in Rome. I don't know if you've ever been in prison. I know modern prisons are not like the prisons of Rome. I can imagine the prisons of Rome are of the same order of the prisons that I was able to visit in the Philippines. And we were able to go to a section of which was the old part of town, which had some of their original prisons. And the holes, they were dug into the ground, and they weren't very large, but they said 50 or 60 men would be in those cells. Nothing above them, so when it rained, it rained. Nowhere to go to the restroom, no way to get out. That's what we're talking about here. This isn't, modern prison has air conditioner, TV, internet, a library, school, 3 meals a day. Anything else you want? That's not what we're talking about here. in a prison of desolation, Paul writes, now listen to the impact of this, rejoice. I would almost imagine, now this is pure conjecture on my part, that when he wrote verse 4, he wept because he rejoiced. Because 20 and 21, Christ will reign supreme over it all and over them all. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. The reason we named this section, follow Paul's example, is because of what he says here. Rejoice in the Lord always, and again, I say rejoice. Not just once, but twice. You recognize the blessings that you have. And then verse 5, he says this, let your moderation be known unto all men. The Lord is at hand. One who exercises forbearance will understand and will show to others that there's something more in his mind to this law, to this life. You know, the Lord's presence is nearby, although it's unseen to the human eye. God, who knows our every act, our every word, our every thought, our every motive, and knowing that God's word, it judges the thoughts and intents of the heart. Isn't it nice to know that He's not very far from us? Never seen Him, have you? But He's there. One of the reasons I believe Paul said rejoice. Proverbs 15:3 says, the eyes of the Lord are in every place, beholding the evil, now listen to this, and the good. Look at verse 6. This is where we're going to pick up next week. Verse 6. Be careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving let your requests be known or be made unto God. He's getting ready to wind this down. And here's what he tells them. You lean on God. He's right there. Not only you lean on Him, but you let your every request be known. To who? To Paul? To God. This verse says that in none of the affairs of life be anxious. Why? Why do we have nothing to be nervous about, nothing to worry about? Now, this is very hard in application. But why do we have nothing to worry about? Remember chapter 3, verses 20 and 21? Eternity focused. Christ overcomes all. All day, every day. In the end, whether short or long your life, the judgment day will exist. And all of this little stuff we think matters so much won't matter anymore. Second bell is rung, and that means our time is unfortunately up. I would love to keep going tonight. It's become, as I've studied this more and more, my favorite section of this book. But read the rest of this book, not for next week. We'll have our gospel meeting next week, but for the next week, and we will finish this particular section out. Then we will have a couple of very pointed classes as we make it into November, and then I won't see you for 3 weeks. And then I will be back. So we'll end tonight and see you next week. See you Sunday for the gospel meeting. Don't forget that. Thanks.